going to introduce what is the background of ecopsychology. The definition is kind of abstract. It has roots in deep ecology and ecofeminism, but it's to be confused with ecotherapy, which is a little different. So I'm going to start with some definitions. In Wikipedia, it describes ecopsychology is an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary field that focuses on the synthesis of ecology and psychology and the promotion of sustainability. It is distinguished from conventional psychology as it focuses on studying the emotional bond between humans and the earth. So I did want to emphasize the synthesis and the emotional bond. So there's something that connects humans and the earth together in this concept of how we live. Next, this definition from the Society for Environmental Population and Conservation Psychology. So ecopsychology explores human psychological interdependence with the rest of nature and the implications for identity, health, and well-being. So the interdependence part I also wanted to emphasize, and also this is maybe a step further in that there are implications to this connection, which brings me to Andy Fisher's perception of ecopsychology, which he kind of adds on that radical aspect. He explains that radical really refers to the root of the disconnection or the connection we have with the earth. So paraphrasing what he says, it would be that ecopsychology is a recollective and critical study of our relationship with the earth that is recognizing the inseparableness of the human psyche with the earth psyche and examining why our social systems actually create and maintain the opposite dynamic. So there is a disconnect that we see between human and what we consider as nature. So my take on this is based on Andy Fisher's definition or perception of ecopsychology, but I want to bring out that there are paradoxes in our human realities. We have an inherent connection with the earth or with nature, and we also have a disconnect with it as a social species. Theoretically, in the philosophical side, I look at German philosopher Martin Heidegger's philosophy, which very simply as in we're thrown into the world when we're born with this context of past, present, future in a social sense, which gives us a sort of this anxiety of not knowing where we are. There's that placelessness that's part of our existential quality, but at the same time, we really yearn for place because of that. When I look at eco in its original Greek meaning, it actually goes back to home or habitat. I think also ecopsychology is about finding or returning to our true existential home. So why should environmental design professions care about ecopsychology? You're already here. I assume that you don't really need much of a rationale for that. But I will be going through a case study on landscape architecture because of my PhD research. So I want to really emphasize that even though it's talking about landscape architecture, the bigger points are not exclusive to landscape architecture or landscape architects. And I hope that you can find resonance in whatever professional title you identify with and find and consider where the relevance areas are. So ecopsychology actually gives a good opportunity to look at what really is landscape architecture. So a serious questioning of what landscape architecture is all about. And in my research, I surveyed 53 people in landscape architecture. Most of them were landscape architects and interviewed 14 landscape architects. And I analyzed 17 professional association documents, mainly in Canada and the US. Basically, I asked people to consider the idea of what I call poignant landscape experiences and also what it means to flourish. So there's like these two sides and try to interpret what people think. One little finding, I guess, from the survey was that there was a common theme about the aspect of nature. These are just the points that I had here. Out of 9 images, which included geological sites, built structures, and cultivated landscapes, a forage image ranked first as most poignant. When I asked about the effects of a past poignant landscape experience, it made me feel a special connection to nature was ranked first out of 11 options. When I asked about how a past poignant landscape experience influenced the participant, 56% said that the experience affected their views of nature. When I asked about the most important goals for a fulfilling life as a landscape architect, creating more natural habitats and sustainable ecological systems ranked first out of 9 options. And when I asked about the best ways to achieve a fulfilling life as a landscape architect, by cultivating a strong connection with the natural environment ranked first out of 6 options. When I asked which goals were considered most important to doing good landscape architecture, creating places that respect the natural environment and existing ecological systems ranked first out of 12 options. And when I asked about the best ways for the profession to aspire to good landscape architecture, engaging with the natural environment were ranked first out of 10 options. In every question that had something about nature, it came out first. And to me, it seemed like not a surprise, but I was surprised at the same time because a lot of landscape architects and people I were surveying were not necessarily working on things that were directly related. The conclusion was that the idea of nature is important to the psyche of landscape architects and thus important to the landscape architecture profession. But one of the difficulties or complex things about this is that we don't really have a straightforward idea of what is nature. While we may agree that human beings are part of nature, if we check our language, it's actually quite contradictory and things get in a mental conflict. So based on the language of research participants, I got that nature was vague, contradictory, and even something to reject. There were cases where implication that urban design isn't about nature or that there's some difference between natural landscapes and human-made landscapes, a very distinct line between them. But one consistent feature that I found in their descriptions was that nature is seen as something that we are in a relationship with. And I also found that it was similar to parent-child relationship. And that's not to say that everything about nature is nurturing or parents are all nurturing, because I think of it as maybe a spectrum between beneficial or dysfunctional relationships. Because of course, nature is also comes with catastrophes and the food chain and all that stuff. So what came out of this was that I gave a definition to nature that's more encompassing. I would say that nature is the manifestation of the material world, so whatever physical, tangible, etc., sensible, which may or may not include humans and our creations in the world, depending on a society's interpretation of their human-world relationship. So really it's nature as actually the interpretation of our existential relationship as a human being. And then going off of that, I see landscape as the processing of this relationship, how an individual processes nature and their consciousness as an impression of a place or an actual portion of the material world that embodies this impression. To add on to that, I see landscape as a mediator between place and nature. But of course, I need to give you something to think about in terms of what is place. For me, it's where we feel grounded, belonging, or connected. And we could debatable whether place is just physical or it could be more. So I would say that it is also physical or emotional environment. Because of all that, pretty much the meaning of landscape and nature are contingent on human perspective. So our worldviews, cosmologies, interpretations of the world will shape our sense of place. And because landscape architecture, or more broadly, environmental design, or anything that has to do with making place, is an intentional act of forming the idea and the material aspects of human dwelling, which in itself is an eco-psychological process because you're looking at the interface between the human psyche and the earth psyche together. What are the implications of this? I wanted to look at the recollective and critical analysis part of landscape architecture, environmental design. Part of this is to look at the ethical side of what landscape architecture is about. And this is kind of self-described or self-categorized as an ethical profession because people would sometimes call going into landscape architecture or doing that as a life calling. And there's professional ethics that is part of it. When we think of ethics, we usually think of something that's based on morality, what's right and what's wrong, or a judgment. But there is the other type of morality, which is what we inherently align with. And generally, I would say it's for the greater good, but then we don't necessarily know what's the greater good as an individual from our own perspective. So that is debatable. Examples of this type of ethics would be from the Taoist perspective. So what's natural? It's a non-moral type of ethics, and it's not judgmental. Similarly, the ethic of flourishing, which looks at relational qualities and that ethical agents make choices and then learns from them. So looking at what the ethical responsibilities of landscape architects are, I looked at association documents and we got keywords such as honesty, transparency, following the law, those kind of things, which is aligned to the ethics number 1 that I described earlier. And then talking to landscape architects in the context of flourishing, the ethics changes to keywords such as integrity, courage, fun, empathy, which is aligned to the number two. And we need a certain amount of sovereignty to determine what is the right type of ethics first, if we're talking about the number two type of ethics that I described earlier. And I want to note that there is discrepancy between what comes out of the mouths of landscape architects versus what's in the documents. So what can someone do about this when we think of landscape architecture as an ethical profession? The first thing that would probably come to mind is designing better landscapes. But how do we do that? Maybe create places for opportunities for people to reflect or to become aware of themselves or of the world. The other aspect that's really less considered, but more important and particularly more important as the critical aspect of ecopsychology is that landscape architecture is a social process itself. No matter what type of work, whether the product or the outcome is for animals, plants, environments without people, landscape architecture always includes a human-to-human process. The process in itself can be also considered the flourishing aspect of it. And I think that's where we have opportunities to look more at where the tensions and the paradoxes, the hypocrisies, and the disconnect between the human psyche and the natural world psyche and how that's maintained. So if we have all these idealistic ideas of what being ethical in a flourishing way means, then how often do we do things in the opposite way, like stuff down our opinions and ideas, fear speaking up, fear losing jobs, clients, or friends, or feel dejected or rejected and follow trends instead of following our creativity and integrity? So I want to say that this is not a judgment. It's really a reflective question to answer, because an ethic of flourishing is also about choosing the worthwhile battles and forgoing the rest. If you did say that this happens, then you're not alone, because I want to introduce the idea of, or maybe you already know about it, the holographic principle, considering that the universe may be holographic. In quantum physics, there is this theory that the universe is holographic, in that what we see in the three-dimensional aspect is really an encoding of what fits into a 2D surface area. And every part of the hologram contains information of the whole scene, like a smaller window, like each piece of the hologram captures a unique perspective of the whole scene. I'm not sure if anyone remembers those cards that were popular maybe in the 90s. I'm not sure when, that the holographic cards, where if you cut them up, you can still see the entire image in the fragments that you cut up, but you actually only see parts of it. So if the world is like this, then we are actually encoded with the data of the rest of the world, even though we are all separate. And I'm not just saying that just human beings, it's like everything in the universe. At the same time, flourishing is reciprocal. So an individual can flourish if their environment allows them to do so. But a flourishing individual will also strengthen the flourishing of the environment. And as Robin Wall Kimmerer, the author of Writing Street Glass, has said, all flourishing is mutual. Earlier, as the question to whether we are always in integrity to our natural north or the ethic of flourishing. And if that is not the case, then the loss of integrity or our ability to flourish is actually a collective phenomenon. Because in a holographic universe, our trauma is collective, but with reciprocal flourishing, our healing instigates collective healing. Fritjof Capra, who's a physicist and a systems theorist, had coined the society's problematic dynamic as a crisis of perception. What I believe is our area we have the biggest crisis in our perception is actually the one about not belonging. So what we have is a crisis of not belonging. And I think crisis is not just, a terrible, bad, doom kind of thing. It's more that there is that point where we have a chance to open up and change. This is something that I've been thinking about. We have a lot of issues in society, and perhaps it's more of a chain reactions. These are common things that we see, the bottom row, common things that we see in our society where natural resources are treated. What our nature or whatever we call our commons is treated as a resource and becomes a part of the economic system. Our habitat, we would say that it becomes part of a housing market. Home ownership is a status of worthiness. And we have a desire, it's a natural desire to have a space of one's own, or reconnecting to nature, as we said earlier, which comes across as maybe like wanting detached housing or living in suburbia or getting a cottage. But when that becomes part of an economic system, then you apply scarcity and the intrinsic need for it, you end up like we have now, that crisis of affordable housing and that kind of stuff. And lastly, we commodify ourselves, become part of a labor market and get self-worth based on whatever assets, whether it's identity, whether it's material, money, etc., to fill in some sort of void. To preserve that self-worth, other people have to be put into some sort of hierarchy. So what I'm saying is that all those things that we're looking at in the news or in our studies may actually just be the symptom of something else. And there's mirroring between what we think of the world and what we think of in ourselves. It starts with we are not enough, and therefore there's scarcity in the world, and the world does not have enough either, so that things have to be created and exchanged value in order to accommodate this kind of perception of the world. If there's this lack of belonging and the lack of place in our systems, then we are actually constantly seeking for place and constantly seeking for home. But Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who recently passed away, actually reminds us that our bodies may actually be our first home. At the same time, we may, or collectively may have be abandoned this home because of a lot of pain in there. So there are many reasons why you have abandoned your body. In your body, there may be feelings and emotions that are unpleasant. If you know how to create a feeling of peace and joy, of happiness in your body, in your feelings, you're in the process of creating a true home for yourself. Carl Jung refers to the rejected parts of ourselves as the shadow self, and the healing process is about reintegrating our shadows from the unconscious into the conscious. He also talks about the collective unconscious. When we look outside into the world or on the news or whatever, does it not look like our collective shadows are coming out to catch us? Well, on the other hand, is it really something that's just calling us to return home collectively? How are we as a society handling these shadows? Because if place is really a sense of belonging, then can placemaking be political or can be partial in ways? I think that's very difficult for professions to not be because they're part of the social system. But I do think that there's a fine line between re-traumatizing ourselves by chasing the shadows in our social political problems and creating belonging by turning on an awareness of our individual and collective pain, particularly through judgmental ethics and binary narratives as a means to overcome or displace our shadows. I'm going to get into maybe a contentious area because there's a lot of emotions that attach to this. Areas that environmental professions get into are social justice and climate change. So I'll bring into a context with that. What I would call this slippery slopes of how we narrate these areas. And one is binary narratives. And I think it's not necessarily things that we talk about specifically, but what is the story behind our discussion or the discourse around these areas. An example of this would be found in the settler indigenous discussions, the racial discussions. Behind all that, there's the perpetrator and the victim archetype of these stories. The issue with this is that when it's a binary narrative, it remarginalizes those outside of the narrative, as well as perpetuate shame and guilt based on racial identity. And I think that applies to both of the binary sides, not just the perpetrator. And lastly, it reminds everybody within the narrative and those without, that we all don't belong, which I don't think is very useful if healing is our goal. On top of that, there are cases of institutionalizing forms of correctness. And this is maybe an issue because it becomes an indirect type of control. Silencing or reducing dissent because of unconscious shame, guilt, or fear that's created through historical patterns of violent traumas relating to authorities that may still be in the pain of our bodies or our documents, collective unconscious, let's say. On top of that, it's really repressive because you actually don't leave room for personal reflection and healing process when this historical trauma of authorities is sitting there and saying that this is what we should believe in. There's no room to work things out by ourselves and just follow the patterns. But behind this is, what is the true goal? Is the attempt to alleviate the pain of anger, guilt, or fear by displacing it into action or documents, activities, etc.? Or really is it a path so that we can heal the pain that's beneath it? Moving on to climate change, there's something similar in that, but things have been changing a bit, I think. So polarizing narratives such as saving the planet really has a more hero perspective, which kind of dismisses the responsibility that we have. And on the opposite side, saying that we were like beings are destroying the planet, it kind of perpetuates a self-blame that doesn't really help the process. On top of that, often I hear people talk about those people, like the greedy people, like the business people, the politicians, etc., as a way to describe our issues. First start, we already partition up humanity. And when I talk about belonging, that doesn't really help. One aspect of maybe not exactly climate change, but as an attempt to get back into balance about reconnecting to nature, the nature connection movement, which is it's good in itself, but there's like I call it an elephant in the room in that personal and cultural relationships with nature have historically not been equitable and they still aren't. So this could trigger personal and cultural insecurities related to self-worth and one's own self-nature, like the discomfort with the body as the nature we know of ourselves and also in comparison to other people. But even though reconnecting with nature is important, it's described as learning to love nature. It's how can we create a better world with our environment. But I think that learning to love nature only works when we know what love is, love in the big capital L. If humanity is suffering from a collective trauma of not belonging and not enoughness, how would we know how to love nature? So the first act of connecting to nature and to effectively work through decolonization and climate change, for me at least, is to learn to be loved by nature instead. And when I say learn to be loved by nature, it's not about like ecotherapy or finding serenity in nature and being dependent on nature. It's really about that deep knowing that we belong in the world because we are part of a greater nature. So that it's sort of existential love. How to be loved by nature is really, I go back into what I started my research on, which was poignant landscape experiences. Poignant landscapes to me are gateways to understanding our existential belongingness. So in the descriptions of poignant landscapes that I got from my research participants, I found that there were a common thing was the feeling of connectedness. So they come out in different ways. So such as feeling totally immersed in the place, connected with the place, opening to the awareness of being part of a greater nature. So connecting to something bigger, noticing elements in nature that have been taken for granted. The same with connecting to things that we don't know, like nature itself. And the other one I think is particular to environmental design professions is being moved by how one's actions have affected others. So the connectedness to another person because of what we've done through landscapes. But also the alternative is important in that some descriptions of poignant landscape experiences actually alluded to disconnect. So the awareness of not belonging, not connecting. And this is found in not finding place or not being at home, metaphorically in the description or physically as well. And they're usually accompanied by fear or other sources of emotional pain. So poignant landscapes is an indirect, implicit way that tells us that we belong or we so crave to belong existentially that we actually, from that experience, we know that belonging is true. I say the poignant is really, I left it open because that's for interpretation. I bring this back to earlier about being loved by nature is that if we are nature, then learning to be loved by nature also means learning to love ourselves. So through a poignant landscape experience or any kind of poignant experience, actually, I think, is that you learn to reflect that back into ourselves. So how does this existential stuff all apply to our day-to-day lives? I actually should have said that before. It's like for starters, if we're part of nature, then we learn to be loved by nature means learning to love ourselves so that we can mend the chain reaction of not belonging and placelessness at its root cause. Even though we're talking about loving ourselves, it's not like all landscape architects, environmental designers, etc., should just stop designing and instead become therapists. I think of place as a concentric circle, or there's scales to place. Starting at the self and the body is our first locus of place, and then we go into our relationships, whether that's personal or then also our social interactions and relationships in the professional sphere, and how that applies into the world. When I started my PhD, I thought I was going to get answers of how to design better landscapes. and like what can I learn from Poignant landscape so that that can be applied to what landscape architects can do, sort of a manual. Maybe some of you came to the webinar thinking that would be some clear recommendations of that as well. But my conclusion out of whatever the last few years was that we are not there yet. We don't know the how to go about that because we haven't really established the why. I think this is the time to reevaluate the role of a design professional for our present day needs, which is different than before. The original question was, what is landscape architecture, that I asked in the beginning in terms of eco-psychology, I think should be rephrased as, what do we want landscape architecture to be? And I also would suggest change that to whatever professional identity you or professional body you want to put that to be. The case is that it's time to be able to, there's opportunity to reevaluate the profession so that it actually fits into what we want it to be. In the case of landscape architecture, I think that the identity aspect is one thing. And in this case, there's ambitious goals to change the world for the better, not necessarily talking about individuals, but more on the professional body aspect, except there's ambiguous about where should we start, empirical studies and objective goals versus critical theory and meaning making. At the same time, there's insecurity with the professional identity, and this is maybe more particular to landscape architects than other professions, because there's a comparison to other professions, like people don't know who we are and if we're just gardeners or etc., that kind of thing. It's also organized professional associations, and which has legal implications, such as the Title Act or the Practice Act. In Ontario, we have a Title Act which says you can't advertise yourself as a landscape architect unless, well, this is what I conclude, is that you can't advertise yourself unless you are a member of the association. And there's been talks of trying to get that into Practice Act, which that you can't say that you practice as a landscape architect unless you're a member of the association. And an anecdotal story that I have is that one of my research participants was attending a National Reconciliation gathering in Ottawa. And during her break, she was sitting there, and an Indigenous man goes up to her and asks her, who is she? And for some reason, she instinctively said she was a landscape architect instead of saying her name. And then the Indigenous man says that, well, I'm a landscape architect too. I take care of the land. And at that time, she felt that was a poignant experience because she realized that was what the goal, the essence of landscape architecture was. But for me, it also showed that there's this dichotomy between what the essence of the professional role is versus the legal role. And that legally, he can't really say he's a landscape architect, but obviously he's not advertising. So what I'm going to show here is an idea that I have is looking at landscape architect as an archetype, which is a modern archetype, particular to our times, one who navigates the complexities of the social and ecological world through a relationship with landscapes. In the descriptions of what an ideal landscape architect is based on landscape architects is the co-creators of place for human dwellings, steward of land and culture, transdisciplinary professional, a compassionate individual who sees their work as personal growth and social responsibility, and a person who is wise enough to know their place in the world, but also humble enough to know that they are always in a state of becoming. It's not implicit that this is the goal of landscape architect, especially from the professional body, but it's something that people talk about. But at the same time, these are really aspirations for any human being engaging in our present day world. I think that looking at the professional body from maybe more of an archetype versus an identity aspect may give more potential in engaging between professions and as well as non-professionals. If we're all going towards the same goal, then we have something in common to look at. Train of thought here to build on this is the idea of the third culture. If anybody remembers the folk song about Canada, land of the silver birch, I'm just thinking let's think of the land itself and our impressions of the land. The song itself was in a controversy a few years ago about cultural appropriation, etc., but I don't want to go into that. But it does bring into the idea of not belonging, Canada, a land of not belonging. On a Reddit thread I recently saw, there was a person who was describing how they came to Canada as a child, as an immigrant, and they grew up here, but they feel really not like they belong. And that really resonated with me. But the other thing was that There was probably 200 to 300 comments in that thread that actually people were also agreeing with that in their own personal experience, and not just people, immigrants, but there were people who were indigenous and white and etc. So I think, oh, Canada could be a land of not belonging. But someone pointed out that the official term for that person would be the child of the third culture. And something that people agreed that Canada may be a place to create a different identity out of it. And I thought that that is interesting in that that brings us to land of the third culture. The third culture part was something I read also in the book Exploring the Boundaries of Landscape Architecture. The editors described landscape architecture as the third culture that bridges sciences and the humanities. Not successfully, because we have the other social issues embedded with that. I thought that there's an interesting train of thought here that we can switch between the idea of not belonging and a third culture that actually can be implied in a profession that cannot really fit into a discipline so much. So if there's anything to come out of this presentation, it's that we actually have a choice to see things differently. So I'm going to end with just a comparison of two perspectives on the idea of poignant landscapes from my research. One is from a selection of survey participants based on the question, how well do you think the profession of landscape architecture is succeeding in making poignant landscapes? Got some answers here. Everyday landscapes are not poignant. I prefer to make useful places in urban environments. I don't see us doing much of anything that could be poignant at that scale, and not much of our work falls into that category. Maybe try a different term. On the other hand, I had these type of answers in interview participants. It's framed differently, and interviews are different than surveys. The question was, do you see a role for poignant landscapes in landscape architecture? And someone said, how could you imagine the opposite? Imagine if there were none. What would you be doing? I can't really imagine I can't imagine landscape architecture without poignant landscapes. Like, what else would we be doing? What else would we really be doing? Making certain things just work, I guess. I guess we'll just be making things work. And someone else says, poignant, I think, is something that tugs at your heart. It's something that speaks to you. We're responsible for so many different things, and I think we're responsible that natural communities will flourish and the human society flourishes. Without immersing ourselves in the emotions of others, without reaching out empathetically, whatever we can build anywhere. What makes it special is how the people who live in it, who work in it, who interact with it, feel about it.